Hi, Elizabeth. Yes, the webinar will be recorded and available after in an email. Katie, do you want to get started, you think?
Sure, let's do this. Terrific. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here and joining us today for this, what I think is a very important conversation around community and belonging in higher education. So I'm Katy Kappler. I am the co-founder and CEO of InScribe. I will be facilitating our discussion today. We are really excited to be able to sponsor this event in partnership with WGU Labs, which is a research and market development organization affiliated with Western Governors University. And for those of you who are not familiar with InScribe, we are a student engagement platform, and we really focus on incorporating the power of virtual communities and artificial intelligence to help connect learners with answers and resources and individuals across your campus that will help them find success in their education journey. And a little later, we'll talk about ways to learn more about InScribe and connect with us. But for now, we'll focus on the conversation at hand. So a couple logistics for today. We want to move the slide forward. First and foremost, definitely feel free to share anything that you hear or learn or questions that you have on social media, and can do that through the following links. We'll also share the handles for all of our speakers today if you want to call them out or tag them in any of your posts on Twitter. We also really want to set up this webinar today as a conversation, not just between myself and our panelists, but really between all the attendees that are here today. So during the discussion, you'll see we'll periodically put up prompts asking you for your feedback and ideas and examples from your own experience. You can enter that information in the chat feature. So I'm told that in order to activate the chat feature, if you scroll down near the bottom of your WebEx experience where the mute button is and the video button would be, there's a little bubble, chat bubble, and if you click on that, that will cause the chat feature to pop up on your right-hand navigation. If you get stuck on that, if you have any questions, post that in the Q&A area and one of our facilitators will help you navigate that a little bit. We also have that Q&A feature. So if you have questions for the facilitators or any of our panelists, please post them there. And we have some folks monitoring that. They've been given authority to interrupt us at any time if we're just waxing on. And we'll try to get as many of those as we can. And if we can't get to everything, we will, provide thoughts and answers on those in one of our follow-up communications. Today's webinar is being recorded, so that will also be shared with you after the event. Okay, enough logistics. Let's move on to the good stuff. Let me introduce our panelists today. So while I am moderating, next slide. Great. So today with me, I'm happy to have Kevin Kelly, who is a lecturer faculty at San Francisco State University. Kevin teaches online in the Department of Equity, Leadership Studies, and Instructional Technologies, and he has also served as the online teaching and learning manager. He works with colleges and universities as a consultant to address distance education, educational technology, and organizational challenges. He is co-author with Katie Linder and Tom Tobin of a new book called Going Alt AC, a guide to alternative academic careers. And he is the lead author with Todd, Kevin, I'm going to butcher that name.
Zakrajek.
Thank you. Of the upcoming book, Advancing Online Teaching, Creating Equity-Based Digital Learning Environments. So that will be coming out in September. We'll share more information on that as well. I'm also happy to introduce Omid Fotuhi, who is the Director of Learning Innovation at WGU Labs, and also a research associate at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Fotuhi is a social psychologist. He has a research focus on motivation and optimal performance, and is a nationally recognized speaker with over 15 years of experience training students, athletes, and leaders to optimize performance. Dr. Fotuhi earned his PhD in psychology from the University of Waterloo and completed a postdoc at Stanford University. While at Stanford, he co-founded the College Transition Collaborative, one of the largest multi-institution collaborations to deliver belonging intervention to over 40,000 students. and the Stanford Interventions Lab, a research group committed to sharing and scaling insights from psychology to better promote performance and well-being. So we couldn't be in better company to talk and have this conversation. I also will say that Omid has admitted to me that he tends to get on a roll when it comes to these topics, so he's given me permission to jump in if we need to move the discussion along. But yes, I think we're all super excited to have this conversation today. So moving on, I thought I would just take a couple of quick minutes to just set the stage on the next slide in terms of what we really mean by community when we think in higher education. So of course, one of the main goals of community is connecting individuals to each other. People often, their mind goes to connecting students with other students, but at a university, that really also means connecting students to staff, to faculty, and to the sort of concept of the institution itself, so that we can give people the relationships and the support mechanisms that they need to be successful and build social capital for not just their education, but when they move on. I will also say that I think community is also about access to information and giving students the ability to find resources, content, and answers that will help them successfully navigate their learning experience. At the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is empower students, give them a sense of confidence and build their sense of belonging, so that they can not only be successful in their learning, but carry forward those attributes as they move on into their career. And community is what we are here to talk about today. So with that, I'm going to jump into our first prompt and ask our audience members to get engaged. And so clicking over to the next slide. So a couple of things. I'm actually going to expand on this question a little bit because we are just getting the conversation going. So first of all, we'd love to know what brought you here to the webinar today, and any reflections or insights you can share about how you are currently establishing community among your students at your institution. And again, if you want to go ahead and just put those right in the chat, send them out to all of our participants so we can see, and we'd love to have a little bit of a conversation about that. Kevin and Omid, as people start to kind of generate some thoughts there, what's been interesting for me in my work is seeing how the application of community is not a one-size-fits-all scenario. And we work with institutions like, we just work with Arizona State University, and for them, their focus is more on in the work that we're doing with them on the information side and about scaling. So they really want to connect students with answers in a scalable way so they can teach more and more students more effectively. And that's sort of juxtaposed with some of the work we're starting to do with Western Governors University, who obviously also cares very much about scale, but in our work, it's more about the human connections and what that can mean for facilitating the process of enrollment and getting your feet under you at the university.
And you have one question from Jeremy, who's interested in learning how community is growing in online education and how to make it. Sorry, now we're getting a ton of questions, which is great.
How to make it more effective.
Yeah, so let's see. If Kevin or Omid, do you guys, either of you want to jump on the question about how communities are evolving in education and what we're doing to make them more effective?
I think we're going to cover this a little bit later on one of the prepared topics, but to answer Jeremy's question quickly and to piggyback on what Katie was saying, the size of the community changes, right? So it can be a learning community within one course of 20 to 40 to 100 students, but it could also be a campus-wide community that you're trying to maintain to help students feel like there's a social aspect to the learning experience when they're maybe staying at home like they did in the spring, or maybe told they're going to stay at home this fall, like my system, the Cal State system, said almost every class except for lab classes would probably be virtual. So we have to work harder to make sure students feel like they're part of a community and not going through this, what I say, and sometimes the online learning experience can feel like we're all together alone. And so we need to find ways to create those connections among the humans involved, between humans and information, and also between humans and spaces or places.
Yeah,
And
that's great.
I do appreciate that that question, because it also highlights a dimension that is important to think about, which is ultimately what is the subjective experience of the individual. And so from that lens, the community size might vary and the approaches might vary, the channels may vary. But if at the end of the day, that one person does not feel that they are a part of a community, then that's what ultimately matters. And essentially where that's useful is recognizing that in those perceptions is an invaluable data point, that being connected to the voices and experiences of the students, independent of what you're trying to do, is at the heart of knowing whether you're doing something effective or not. Great question.
That's great. And I was just kind of reading through some of the great ideas and questions and coming into the chat. I definitely a theme around either, you know, I'm not sure how we're going online in the fall, and I'm not sure how to either maintain the awesome communities that I've built in this virtual experience, or rethink my strategy in virtual. So that's definitely something that we're going to talk about going forward. Also, I think I saw somewhere, I've lost it now, but the idea of community not just being for your students on campus, but really being an opportunity to connect incoming students, prospective students. The particular post didn't say this, but I'll add alumni into that conversation. And there were some really cool ideas in there about using TikTok, Zoom, and places where a lot of students are already going to facilitate that as well. Great. A lot of questions about career preparedness. Well, so thinking about the continuity of community, not just while I'm there learning, but like, what does that do for me as I think about moving out into my career and making that transition smooth as well. So lots of great ideas. And again, we're going to gather up all of the feedback and information that you put into the chat, and also incorporate that into some of the summaries and information that we share afterward. So I'm going to have us move on to our first question for the panelist, which is a good sort of way to segment off of this. So if we move to that next slide. So one of the things we often talk about with community is a sense of belonging. And I see in the chat, that is a common theme. How do I help students feel connected to each other? How do I help them feel connected to campus? It doesn't seem like our attendees are skeptical about the importance of belonging, but I'm just going to put this to our panelists. So when we talk about this, you know, what does it really mean to have a sense of belonging? Does it really matter? Why is this such an important concept for us to talk about? Omid, do you want to lead us off on that?
I'll jump in, and maybe what I'll start off by saying is that I'll give you a brief sort of glimpse into my world in terms of being a social psychologist, which, by the way, my mom still has no idea what that is or what I do. So hopefully that will give you all some clarity about the things that we think about. And one of the things that's important to highlight is, as a social psychologist, we're actually more interested in the questions themselves than we are about the specific answers or solutions. Figuring out what kinds of questions people ask at critical points in their journeys and their life experiences, who they are and when they ask these questions, becomes the central base on which we develop our work. Because the questions that people ask themselves ultimately determine the answers that they come up with, and ultimately determine whether they choose to engage or not. Let me take another step back. As we think about learning, it turns out from a social psychological perspective, is not this mastery of content process that we can't just expect that we give students this content, that they absorb it and then test on it later, demonstrating perfect mastery, and that's the end of it. Instead, learning is actually a social experience. And as individuals, as we develop across various life stages, what we do is we experiment with different social identities to see if we are competent, valued, and respected in those domains. So a student who's going through a math class for the first time will not yet know whether they can see themselves as a competent mathematics student. And so the questions that they ask are, is this a place where I can thrive, be accepted, and come to belong? When it comes to recognizing that it is the questions that drive whether students choose to engage, choose to experiment, choose to take risks, choose to place themselves in that state of learning, which by definition is a state of not knowing, that a state of uncertainty and discomfort. It is the presumed answer that decides for them whether they will stay engaged or not. And when we think of questions, it is also important to recognize that our role as educators, as administrators, as innovators, plays a critical impact on the kinds of answers that students have. Ultimately, we become the gatekeepers to grant access to these various identities that students are experimenting with or not. Because a student might raise their hand in class or reach out for help or try to connect with a group of peers, and not knowing how that will go, those early experiences will shape and color whether they choose to stay engaged and experiment with that identity or say, this is not part of me. I'm actually going to, try something else. So as educators, as administrators, being attuned to those questions, when those questions are being asked, who is asking these questions, we can ensure that we provide the access to allow students to step through the doorways and experiment with the identities of being a learner in that domain, or whether they choose to not believe that they can be and withdraw. So that's a critical question, I think, that is at the heart of a lot of the work that we do, is being attuned to the questions. And when it comes to students, there are 3 core questions that they tend to ask. And again, ironically, has very little to do with the content that they're exposed to in their classes. Instead, what they ask themselves is, do I belong? Can I do it? And does it matter? And how they answer those questions consistently, and especially at critical times, determines whether they choose to stay engaged or not. And in terms of critical times, it is the early experiences that carry a disproportionate weight to the conclusions that students carry with them. If that early interaction is not supportive, if that early request for assistance is not responded to, then they essentially decide that it's not a pathway that they want to explore. So I'll stop there from a very high level and see if there's any thoughts there.
Well, if I can I piggyback on some of that? It's so rich. Working backward though, one reason why I work really hard in the first 3 weeks of my class to make sure I answer every student's question and make sure that I'm doing everything I can to create a sense of community and belonging is because of that very fact that Omid just brought up, that early on is when students are making decisions about whether or not they feel they belong. There's a couple studies from 2018 that gave some other good examples of how to help students feel like they belong, or at least increase opportunities for them to go through those exploration processes Omid brought up. One is having more frequent interactions with a diverse set of peers. The other was providing peer mentoring and staff care and support. Both of those have positive relationships with belonging. But one of the authors of one of the studies said, just have a structure in place that's designed to communicate that students matter. Just because they got into college doesn't mean they feel they're at home there yet. And colleges can provide opportunities for students to connect with others. And this was backed up in the research I did for my own dissertation, where I talked to transfer students from different backgrounds before or after they transferred. And a young Black man said he had felt encouraged at the community college, but felt like he was just another number at the university. He felt like the university wasn't as caring environment. And so he said life got better because he met new people. He physically and mentally felt better just knowing that there's people who had shared experience that he had. So kind of dovetailing on the things that Omid brought up, we can take steps to increase student belonging, or at least the opportunities for them to feel like they belong.
So clearly that not only is there a big impact, but it's something you want to get right at the beginning, because the risk of sort of losing students in those early days seems very pertinent. If we can move on to the next question for the panelists, there was something that came in that I'm going to ask before we move on to this, which is, how do you measure sense of belonging? Is there a way to assess that with your students that's not, you know, that's manageable and accessible for institutions?
Yeah, I mean, there are some established measures. So if you have a process in place, like commonly is seen, these large, massive scale student surveys that are sent out, that's one metric. You can ask a few questions about belonging. I'm not sure it's the best one. In fact, what we found is you can get an incredibly rich amount of information simply by coordinating a small focus group of students. Whose voice, even though they're small in numbers, 10 to 15 sometimes, is a perfect echo of the larger community sense of what it feels like to be a student there. And so that's one of the often underutilized resources. It's just getting students into a room and having a conversation with them, because you're going to pick up on a lot of subtlety and nuance that is completely sort of representative of how they feel they are seen, they are heard, and respected. The other is more behavioral in terms of engagement. So if you have good and equitable and representative engagement across all your student groups, that's also a good indicator that you have a good culture of belonging. However, it is critically important to highlight that belonging disproportionately negatively impacts those who are already contending with many of the structural and psychological factors that are out there. And so when we're talking about equity, when we're talking about stereotypes, threats, absent any other information, those students contending with stereotype threat, which is the perception that they or their group will be negatively viewed or perceived in a particular context, they will default to those negative stereotypes when things get hard, when things get difficult, when things are ambiguous. And so if you find that those groups are not engaged to the same degree, it's because you haven't taken the steps to effectively convey a sense of belonging that is resilient. And then the other is also just going beyond using existing metrics, but being sort of creative with how you capture the voice and the language that students use. So if you're a teacher, for instance, and you find that your teachers are randomly and spontaneously coming up to you and saying, hey, by the way, here's something I had a question about, or hey, by the way, I'd like to share something with you. That shows that you've already established a sense of trust and belonging that allows students to feel safe to experiment and to be seen and to be heard.
Yeah.
Because belonging manifests itself in a feeling that you are invisible, creating the platforms where students take the advantage to make themselves visible is a good indication that you've done things well.
You're making, and I think you did a great job touching on the question here as well, in terms of what are some of the barriers that prevent students from establishing that sense of belonging. Kevin, I don't know if you want to add any thoughts. And
just a couple, yeah. With respect to stereotype threat in particular, the work I'm doing with Peralta Community College District in Oakland, where we created an online equity rubric. One thing you can do to fight stereotype threat as an instructor is to look at the images and media that you use in your courses. Are the students in your classes represented adequately and accurately? I also really like this quote from Michelle Pacansky-Brock from the California Community College System. She right now is working on a project that's humanizing online gateway STEM courses, where some students may not see themselves in that space, and partly because of the stereotypes or lack of representation in mainstream media. But her quote is, creating a sense of belonging is critical. This starts with a positive instructor-student relationship that enables a teacher to challenge students beyond what they believe they're capable of doing. It's not about lowering the rigor in any way. It's about believing in them, pushing back on negative stereotypes and challenging them beyond their self-perceived limits. And those students who are challenged end up doing well or better than students who are not. And then that group that Michelle works with, the online network of educators, has 2 relevant courses that are publicly available for people to adopt. One's called Equity and Culturally Responsive Teaching, which does address stereotype threat as one of the equity challenges. And the other is Humanizing Online Environments, which covers strategies that lay the foundations for building community. One last thing, I won't go into too much detail, but a less obvious strategy for helping students feel they belong to address this psychological and contextual barriers is seeking diversity when you hire faculty and staff. If the students don't see themselves in the people who are helping them succeed, they sometimes don't feel like they belong. And I don't want to forget about the challenges that first-generation students face with respect to what's called the hidden curriculum, where we might use mentors or even one-unit courses to better prepare first-generation students so they feel like they belong in an environment that they don't understand as well as others.
That's great.
I'll mention just one more.
I'll maybe one thing. So Kevin's rattling off, and I think Omid as well, a bunch of awesome resources. So we'll gather up all of that as well and make sure we send it out to everybody as a follow-up. But Omid, sorry, please continue.
Thank you. When it comes to barriers, there's 2 broad categories. I think there are the contextual barriers, the lack of structures and supports, the cues that students might be exposed to. So if you are clearly underrepresented, if you're a female in an engineering class and you're one of 3 females in that class, and you have to walk down the hallway to the bathroom, which was built as an afterthought because it's a male predominant institution, and as you're walking to the bathroom, you see a picture of old white guy after old white guy, and you've just had a bad interaction or a bad grade. These cues carry a very specific meaning to those individuals who are already wondering whether they do belong or not. So there's the contextual cues, there is the psychological cues, such as the stereotype threat that we mentioned, growth mindset, whether you believe you can grow, whether you believe you can perform at a competent level. But then there's also another psychology that I think is important, and that's called pluralistic ignorance. And it's a particularly subtle but pernicious issue, because at the heart of what makes not belonging or belonging uncertainty damaging to students is that you feel that this anxiety, this uncertainty, this feeling like you're somehow not belonging or different is unique onto you. When in fact, almost everybody during critical stages of transitions feels this way. In fact, there's a term for it, impostor syndrome. We all have it as we transition to new roles. But what makes it damaging is that you feel like you're the only one. And what that does is it causes you to shut down and look inward, as opposed to reaching out, as opposed to talking about the issues and the uncertainties, as opposed to trusting that others are going to be there for you and that what you're going through will dissipate with time. If you're able to cast away that casing, that shelter that causes belonging uncertainty to keep people from reaching out, then when they start engaging, that in itself becomes a process that allows them to see, hey, you know what I was feeling is actually commonly experienced by everybody. And as I'm talking to people, I'm seeing that they're getting over it, and so am I. Yeah. Absent that bridge that allows you to feel like others are going through what you're going through, you might be at risk for staying locked into that state of belonging and uncertainty, which then causes you to disengage.
Right. And so one quick question for you. It was pernicious ignorance was the term. I mean, a couple of folks asking about it in the chat, but
pluralistic ignorance is
pluralistic ignorance. Sorry, the word got lost in this. There you go, everyone. And then also, I think a lot of people relating to what you're talking about in the chat. I think what's sort of ironic about, especially folks who are moving into an online modality and worrying about community building in online, is the truth is virtual communities actually have some opportunities to overcome some of these challenges in a different way than physical communities do, because they sort of remove the barriers of place and time. Our experience has been that they actually allow students to connect with a broader group of individuals than they might do if they were just on campus. So the opportunity to see yourself in the community is a little bit greater. And they also, I think, because digital communities in the most part are open, right? So people are sharing their ideas and their challenges, and everyone can see those. The opportunity to not feel so alone, like, oh, I'm the only one that doesn't get it, I'm the only one that feels this way, is lessened because you're immediately connected with other people who are asking that same question that you thought nobody else was going to ask, or struggling with that same thing you thought nobody else was struggling with. So in a way, getting virtual communities right almost, can help address some of these challenges. Certainly they're not the only solution, but I think that's kind of an interesting upside maybe for folks who are thinking about how to build some of this rapport in the fall if they're going to be in an online environment. Let's go on to our next prompt on the next slide, because we are curious for those. One more slide. Thank you. So the sense of belonging is so critical. There are ways that we can get it wrong, and we have to be really intentional about how we think about it. So we're just curious from folks, either those who have worked on community building or just anticipating working on it, what challenges are you having, or do you think that foresee having in building this community for your students and in tackling some of the issues that Kevin and Omid just brought up in terms of making sure that it's accessible to everybody and really reinforcing a sense of belonging for all students. And so while we kind of focus, while people are thinking about that and posting some comments on that, I'd be curious, Kevin, in your classroom, you've obviously worked on this a lot. You're very intentional about what you do, but were there bumps along the road for you that you didn't anticipate and you had to react to and overcome?
Yes, and right now we're finding even more bumps, especially from this past semester or quarter, depending on your school, and the stay-at-home orders. One of the things we have to address early, and I am strongly suggesting that campuses address this now over the summer, is technology access issues. You can't participate in a virtual community if you don't have a device or if you don't have access to adequate internet. And it's not just rural campuses where some students are having inconsistent internet access. If you look at different student surveys around the country, nationwide, almost a quarter of students don't have reliable access to the internet where they can get it anytime they want. And almost the same number don't have regular access to a device, maybe because they're staying at home with other adults or other students and they're all sharing the same computer. And some, a very small number, but still some don't even have smartphones. So we need to create multiple pathways for students to join and participate in those community activities, even if it's using like the phone dial-in option for a video conference like this, so they can at least participate by voice. Campuses should be finding out who needs a device or a Wi-Fi hotspot and sending those well before the fall starts. Other things, creating community spaces on different platforms or promoting student-created community spaces. Building on one of Katy's opening comments, one of the transfer students I interviewed said it was important to see faculty and staff in those spaces. It's not just a space for students, but it's an entire campus community. Hosting regular virtual social events, because both academic and social aspects of the learning experience are important. Schools like Elon University started hosting virtual events soon after closing their campus this spring. That included things like weekly coffee chats, wellness activities, professional development that students could participate in as well as staff. Hosting regular virtual academic support events. My co-teacher, Maria Fernandez, and I hosted what we called work sprints, where students joined short study periods on Zoom. They were surprised to find that they were really productive, even though we only talked to each other to share our goals before we started a 25-minute block. And then after we shared how we did, they said they felt they were studying with others, even though they were silent, and it made them feel accountable. We did this for our class at the end of the semester, but a campus could host work sprints every week where our students could join at times that are appropriate for them. And most importantly, and then I'll hand the talking stick over to Omid, we need to talk to the students themselves. We talk a lot about students without talking to students. And so I encourage campus community developers to include students in the process of what would be useful, what would be practical, and so on. Omid, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that last point is probably really critical enough to echo again. Sometimes when I get brought into a school and they say, you know, knowing all that you know from the research, can you tell us how to improve our student outcomes and student experiences? And I say, well, I'm flattered. Thank you for thinking that I have that power. But have you thought about utilizing the most important and valuable resource that you have? And they're kind of like dumbfounded, not having any clue as to what I'm saying. And I proceed to say your own students to see what they need and what they might be feeling and experiencing. So Kevin, I really appreciate that you bring that up, because that's, again, one of the commonly underutilized resources that's available to us. The other thing I'll say is we are facing disruptions in ways that we can't predict what that will look like for our interactions. But when you try to summarize decades and decades of research on what predicts good engagement, ultimately comes down to the human connection, that feeling that you are seen and valued and respected, that you can take risks and not be criticized, that you have someone that knows you. And to the extent that we can invest in the communication, in the resources and the channels. So, you know, Kevin talked about access, ensuring that everyone has not only access to the technology, but that has access to your availability. And as we're going through a disruption, that might mean investing a little bit more time in figuring out what channels students use. Another really sort of small but also important observation is that as we potentially as presenters or teachers have to navigate and connect to our students through the screen now, sometimes we're looking at our own slides, or as I sometimes do, I tend to look away as I think and talk. But from the student's perspective, they're looking for eye contact, the same fundamentals of human connection that they typically have become dependent on in the face-to-face interactions that are still there, but maybe we're not attuned to. And again, coming back to Kevin's point, being sure that you stay connected to the students' experiences. And that means regular check-ins. That means utilizing small focus groups. That means having your ears on the ground in terms of what students are saying through various channels or blog posts or any other channels that are available. So that's one, I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is that we're going to be facing disruptions that are hard to predict, which might require a bit more investment. But ultimately, if you stay tapped into the student's voice, then you'll be able to stay ahead of the curve.
Right, so that's great. So as we move, I'm going to have the slides move forward to the next question, but I'm going to sort of touch on some of the things coming in the chat here, which is, you know, and I think we've touched on some of these things that are coming up, but definitely to your point, Omid and Kevin, wanting to have two things. One, let the students be active in telling you what they need and giving them those opportunities, many opportunities to raise their hand and say, here's where I want to engage, here's what I need. The output of that, as some people have said, is most likely a multi-pronged approach. You're not going to have one place where your students are going to go interact with you or with each other, but you may have to have multiple opportunities. We did have a number of people highlight in terms of challenges, how do they really effectively engage the entire student population? And it looked like there were sort of two populations of concern. One being those who are just naturally introverted or not the ones that are always raising their hands. So you get, you know, the same 6 people participating all the time, and how do you get the others to feel welcome and active? And then the other is, we are not necessarily a world of quote unquote traditional learners anymore. We have many students who are parents, they are working, they are learning online, and it can be overwhelming for them, you know, to have to navigate all of these things. So how do we give them opportunities to engage that doesn't just sort of add one more thing to their long list.
And to build on that, I would say we want to give them opportunities and not penalize them if they can't participate. I was moderating a panel of students last year at the online teaching conference, and one woman was a young mother working full-time and taking classes at a community college so she could increase her pay rate at her work and gain an associate degree. And so she said, while she understands that some of the discussions were rich and vibrant and students who might be living on campus and 19 years old would participate more fully, she had to choose which activities she wanted to complete in order to earn a grade just good enough to keep moving forward, because she had to go take care of her kids or go back to work or whatever. So making sure students see the meaning of these activities that we put in front of them so it doesn't seem like busy work, and also helping them make connections between their own lives and the course topics can help with some of the questions that you've been raising.
Yeah, and I just maybe add that it's important not to, lose the opportunity to take advantage of a good crisis, because in this disruption, we have a lot more affordances and flexibility than we have ever had before. And that gives us a certain level of leniency to go beyond the scripted interactions that we've had with our students and see what works and what doesn't, and experiment. So there's two things there. There's flexibility and humility. Flexibility, really sort of take advantage of how creative you can be. I've heard of teachers, instead of having a 45 or 1 hour long class, we'll break it down into 30-minute classes with smaller numbers of students. Because again, the filter of the screen is something that makes it harder to relate to large groups of students. You can be flexible in terms of what you cover. You can be flexible with how you grade. And at this time more than ever, you probably won't get as much slack about doing that and deviating than you would have previously. So I think building in some flexibility, recognizing that your students are going to have many demands and challenges, and that so are you. You are also going to have difficulty adapting to the technology. And so with that also comes the humility. I think there's, again, a humanity in not knowing everything. And if you are able to convey to your students that you are not this all-knowing authority on everything, but that you are part of this journey with them, and that you too get frustrated, you too feel like this thing does work or that thing does not work, that you too are sort of feeling alone altogether at times, then that helps the students feel like what they're going through is not something that they should be ashamed of, because it's not reflected in terms of how they think you're experiencing life. And I think that's important to note too, because in the past, or in more traditional in-classroom contexts, students will have the opportunity to have these informal conversations with other students as they're waiting for the lecture to start. That's no longer available. And so again, to the extent that they can rely on you sharing and normalizing the very many challenges that all of us are going through, that allows them to maybe reach out, instead of feeling like the only dimension through which you see them is their performance on a particular course or course content.
Yeah, and if I can just put one more bullet at the end of that, is so awesome. I'm going to stay connected with you, Omid. But the concept of being more intentional. So when this slide says, how do we make up for the loss of in-person interaction? We can't just set up an online discussion forum and set it and forget it. We need to be intentional and present. And so instructor presence and course design are two factors in building community successfully. One way I help build presence in my is I not only send out the announcements using the learning management system, but I use remind.com with an opt-in text message service. And I create video versions of my announcements for students who prefer to see my face. And as Omid mentioned, they want to relate and connect with me. And then when it comes to course design, taking the time to build interaction opportunities around the content. So don't skip icebreaker activities at the beginning of the course. Give students the option to submit Flipgrid videos as a discussion forum post or reply. Focus on having students share connections to their lives with each other, create a study buddy sign-up list if you can. Ask students to form groups based on things like the time zone they're in, their work schedules, or their family care schedules, so they have a better chance of participating if they can. I know we're running low on time, so I'll stop there, but there's just, there's so much to this, and I'm so happy that so many people are interested and dedicated to making more community in their campuses and in their classes.
Yes, that's all excellent points. And I think sort of to touch on what Kevin said and some of the other points that we made earlier, which is if you can create spaces that are more student driven, so they are not bound by a particular date or a particular time that people have to be there, but really students can engage and interact when it's convenient for them, when it makes sense for them, when they're in need, you will see participation rates from your students go up, because you're necessarily opening that door for those that are not on a traditional cycle, or those that maybe need a little bit more time to think through what they're going to say before they post it. So I think those can also help touch on those students as well. So I think we had one more question that we wanted to get to in this, and then so we may go over a little over time. I hope folks can stay through till noon. But if we can move on to one more slide. Such great conversation, so many awesome ideas happening in the chat. I think we're going to have a really rich follow-up that we can share with folks. But Erin, if you could just move us forward one slide. There we go. So I'm going to throw this out there, and then we will try and grab some questions coming in from the audience. And then do a quick wrap up. But I'd love to hear, Kevin just rattled off a bunch actually for the classroom. Which
exactly, I didn't realize there was another slide. So
you combined them right together, so that's awesome. So, and that really was one of our questions, like in the classroom, how do we facilitate engagement? And again, we can provide that list of ideas to all of our participants, but any other sort of really tangible, specific strategies that are attending this summer in anticipation of fall for building community in the classroom, outside of the classroom, for prospective students. Maybe we could just give them 2 or 3 ideas that they could take and run with.
One thing that I've been suggesting is to reach out to the recent graduates who didn't have the same recognition ceremony and graduation that most campuses have at the end of each term, each academic experience. Have those students, instead of the 10-second walk across the stage to pick up a piece of paper, have them videotape a 3-minute message about what their degree means to them, what challenges they had to overcome to reach their academic goals, and how they're going to use it in the future, and basically have it be a message to incoming new students of, hey, you can do it too, and really passing the baton to the next cohort of students coming in is one idea that I think would help build community across academic years, so to speak.
That's a great idea, Kevin, and even, you know, certainly a great opportunity for those students who just left and that experience is really fresh. Also, you know, we did have a question about career services and leadership, and thinking through how career exploration helps maintain community, and just to sort of tie this together, I'm sure there's other ideas, but you know, again, bringing alumni into these communities, folks that are practitioners who are working in the roles and places that students are thinking about going, and having them be part of that. So it's not as formal of a career services maybe process that a lot of students would go through, but a really informal way for them to connect with people who are doing and living the lives that they want to live, I think is another great way to empower students and also help the institution build that sense of community. Omid, anything you want to touch on in terms of the strategy piece?
Yeah, you know I do.
Do I even have to ask?
Just cut me off, if you will. I think, yeah, just on that point of leadership, I would say, you know, some of the folks in the audience and are in a role to understand the impact that leadership has, maybe because they themselves are in a leadership position or have some influence. But ultimately, as we think about community and culture, we can't undermine the impact that leaders have, because they are the ones that allocate the resources, that create the experiences and opportunities, that informs the beliefs and encourages the behaviors that ultimately lead to student engagement. And so while we can't change students' beliefs directly, as leadership, recognizing the power that you have to create the experiences and opportunities so that you foster the beliefs that lead to greater sense of belonging is incredibly critical. And with that comes a vision and a commitment to the values that, again, places students at the center of everything that you're doing. The other end of the spectrum of that is, again, recognizing the importance of touching base and connecting with individual students. At Georgia State University, they did an interesting RCT where during 1 year at enrollment, they attached a little sticky note on the acceptance letters to say, hey, we're looking forward to seeing you in the fall or not. And this randomized group of students who got that little note were significantly more likely to actually matriculate than those who didn't. And that conveys that, I'm not just a number. I'm not just this, quota that they have to meet, that when I get there, I will be seen and respected and appreciated. And again, being vigilant and looking for those touch points where you might try to figure out what questions are students asking with the recognition that they're always wondering, do I belong or do I not? So that you can inform the potential to take action and initiative. And so that is, I think, a systematic way in which you can encourage and build up and scaffold greater belonging in your community.
That's terrific. That's great. And if we can move on to Q&A, so because I think there's some questions that really dovetail with that really nicely, which is, so two things I want to do in the Q&A, and then I think we're probably going to run out of time. So if we don't get to your question again, we will have the team provide some thoughts on that. We'll include that in our follow-up for everybody. But one being, do you have any thoughts on digital communities in particular and how they provide potentially an advantage for building community for students, particularly helping students from different backgrounds connect with each other?
I can go first. We've been working with a number of schools who have, taken our advice to connect with their students, and what we're learning is every element of the disruption has both positive and negative. And so students, in the face of being remote, are both recognizing the challenges of not having the luxury of being in the spaces where collaboration happens spontaneously, but are also appreciating the freedom and the flexibility. They're appreciating the reduced transaction costs, the reduced transportation time that it takes, the commuting time, the reduced distraction that happens in the classroom. So there's a lot of benefits that are happening through this digital disruption, or this disruption currently. But ultimately, I think it also highlights the critical role that digital tools play in providing channels. Because ultimately what we're trying to do is foster more of a human interaction, more of a human experience. And to the extent that those digital tools enhance that, I think that's when we're going to get a better learning. To presume that they're going to replace that, I think, is a dangerous line of thinking. But certainly in enabling better connection, I feel like there's great promise there.
That's great. One other question. We have some questions around, which I think we'll take to answer later, around managing the transition of programs where regulations are preventing doing some innovation and change in online. I think that's a really big topic, so I think I'll hold that for sort of our follow-up session. But we did have one other question. So not every school has students that are all starting together in the fall and the spring, and even I think a lot of more traditional schools are playing around with different start dates and things. Any suggestions on how you might rethink your strategy to community when students are starting at different times and maybe aren't all following the same progress through the learning experience? Do you change strategy at all, or do you just same rules apply?
What I shared with Cameron in the chat is that encouraging the students themselves to be proactive and reach out at each start point. Hey, who's interested in sharing contact information or joining a study group, even if it's for a shorter period of time. What if you remember the movie Fight Club? It's single-use friends, like single-serving food on an airplane. But the other thing is that campuses need to create more avenues or fora for these opportunities. So creating spaces in the learning environment for groups to self-organize, creating spaces for students to communicate with one another. To add to a comment that Omid made, some of the student surveys are showing that students are having a really hard time finding contact information for people who have the details they need about financial aid or student advising or different people who are in the student services roles. And so really making those visible, having some kind of hub that students and faculty and staff all go to get connected with, as we've been saying, with people, with information, with the organization.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think even though there's a lot of information out there at institutions, we do tend to have things a bit siloed by many different websites, many different processes. So thinking about bringing that together in a more unified sense can have a really positive impact for students, for sure. So I think we're going to pause there. If we just move on to our last slide. Again, thank you so much for everybody's participation in the chat, all the amazing questions. I'm really excited about the follow-up that we're going to share with you. Certainly myself at InScribe and the team at WGU Labs, thank you so much for helping put this together. Kevin and Omid, I really appreciate all your amazing insights. We would love to stay connected. So, please follow us or find us on LinkedIn, share what you've learned. We are also putting together a community assessment tool for all the participants today. So look for that in your email. That's just a quick way for you to kind of gut check where you are with community, what you're doing well, maybe what some of your challenges and opportunities are. And then we can provide some recommendations on really tactical things going into the fall that you can do to address some of the concerns that you might be facing. One more slide. I'll also say that this is the first webinar in a series that we're putting together. So part 2 will be coming up in a couple of Thursdays from now, and there is really going to be a very practical conversation around student community. So we had some great suggestions and ideas today of things I think people can take and put into action. Here we'll go a little deeper on that and really line out some action items for folks. And then, students aren't the only ones that are learning and facing change right now. So we'll also have a session coming up about faculty communities and what we can be doing to support our faculty during these times of change and helping them connect and learn from one another. So with that said, again, thank you to everybody who participated, to our panelists, and to our sponsors. My name's Katie. If you guys want to connect with me or learn anything more about InScribe, I think one of my colleagues will drop our URL in the chat, but it's inscribeapp.com. We are happy to just have a conversation with you about how you're thinking about community. And of course, if there's anything that we can do to help, we would be happy to help you going into the summer and the fall. So thanks again, everybody, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Be well. Thank you.
Thanks.